Thank you, everyone, for being here with us tonight. We'll just start over from the beginning and go from there. My name's Allison Sansoni. I'm the program director here at the American Writers Museum. And we're here tonight with Elizabeth Berg, who is the author of the new book, I'll Be Seeing You, a chronicle of the aging of her parents alongside the remarkable story of their love for each other and for their family. She's the author of more than 24 books, including Open House and Oprah's Book Club Selection, and Joy School, one of the ALA's best books for young adults. In 2018, she was awarded the State of Illinois Literary Heritage Award for her extraordinary contributions to our literary culture. Welcome, Elizabeth.
Thank you. I'm very glad to be here.
We're glad that you're here too. You can hear me now?
I can.
Wonderful. Sorry about that. We've never had that happen before.
I don't ask me. It's a wonder we've gotten this far on my end anyway, but I'm glad we're here.
Oh, I'm glad that we made it.
For inviting me to come.
Oh, thank you for being here. I wanted to ask a question I always ask memoirists when they've published their books is why now? Why did you choose to bring the story of your parents forward in this moment?
When my parents got to the age where things started happening, my dad got Alzheimer's, and they were really forced to leave the house where they had lived for so long. It was heartbreaking, and it was infuriating, and it was confusing, and I needed, as a writer, to write out all those things I was feeling. I did not intend to publish a book about all this. It's just that I needed to see where I was, so to speak. And one of the things that really helps me if I'm ever going through anything is to hear other people's stories about it. So after everything was over, it occurred to me that if I were to publish this kind of journal that I kept, it might help others. And judging from the response that I've seen thus far, it really has. And that's been really gratifying.
When the book begins, your father's beginning to both forget things and to become frustrated by that forgetfulness and to deny it. What is the role of memory in this book, and how did you negotiate yours and your siblings and your parents in order to create the narrative?
That's a very sophisticated question that presupposes a lot of things I wasn't aware of, really. The book is really my telling the story as it happened. And I was so struck by the poignancy, sometimes by the humor. My father got paranoid when he first started showing symptoms of Alzheimer's. And one of the things, this is an example of both the humor and the poignancy of things that happened. One of the things that happened is he said to my mother, "We don't get along the way we used to. Are you seeing someone?" And, it was kind of funny, but it was also sort of heartbreaking. And he thought that people were coming to sit in his car, and he thought that people were looking in the windows. These are very common things that happen to people with Alzheimer's. And I guess what I want my book to serve as is a don't do what I did type of thing in some respects. I think I did some things well, but I think I made a lot of mistakes. One of those mistakes was in trying to convince my dad of what was real and what wasn't. That just doesn't work. He didn't see it that way anymore. Logic was not the same for him. Reality was not the same. For me to say there's no one looking in your windows was to belie everything he knew and believed about his own situation. So one thing I learned to do is just roll with it a little. And when he would say, "Would you like a glass of wine?" 95 times, 95 times I would say, "No, thanks, I'm fine." Or, well, not 95 times, "Yes, I will." But I was figuring it out as I went along, not only my own reactions to what was happening, but my relationship with my sister, with my brother, with my mother, with my father. It was very interesting how I kind of took sides. In the beginning, I felt like I needed to defend my mother against my father, who was not cooperating with moving and so on. Then it became a situation where I was defending my father against my mother. It's a journey.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's a journey that, I think a lot of people probably watching along are, familiar with or will become so,
Mhm.
unfortunately, in that, when you mentioned the things that sort of become stuck in someone's mind. My grandmother lived to 91, and toward the end, she always had to have a cookie at a particular time. And so she would ask us over and over, is my cookie there on top, on top of the refrigerator? Is it there? Is it there? And we would consistently reassure her that yes, it's there. But
Yeah.
that was the issue, was, what sticks with you in those moments. And so listening to your father, ask the same questions over and over. I mean, did he ever bring up anything that you were unaware of that would surprise you?
No,
Yeah.
no.
Yeah.
Short answer.
Yeah. Parents and children create such different stories about their own families. How did you find when you were writing this book that the story that you thought you were going to write was the same as the one that you ended up telling?
Again, I didn't think of it in terms of writing a book and publishing it. I was just trying to deal with my own emotions and also to have a record of what was happening. Things changed so much. For example, my parents agreed together to move to a place that my sister and I found for them. And we were so relieved, my sister and I, thinking at last they're going to be in a place that's a little safer. It's all on one level. There's good coffee in the dining room. And then abruptly, my father changed his mind. And that was a delicate point for me, because I had to tell my mom, you're going to have to be the one that makes the decisions now. He's not capable. He's not able to say something and commit to it and understand all that comes along with that. He thought of the place where they moved to eventually as a hotel, and asked my mother one night, do they change the towels in this hotel? So um, nonetheless, there were moments of great beauty and clarity and poignancy and love. Um, I think if you're lucky enough to have your parents get old enough that they need help, you inadvertently sign up for a lot of things that you might not have imagined. But it was, when I look back on it now, it was a privilege. And my parents did have an extraordinary love story. And I bore witness to that my whole growing up life. My mother was my father's North Star, his best friend, his true love, the one he wanted to please more than anyone. Um, I grew up hearing him say, "Where's your mother?" He always needed to know where she was. Um, so for him to be put in a position where he was no longer able to take care of her, to have their roles reversed, was difficult. I think he had an awareness of that and tried in his way to take care of her anyway. For example, after they moved, he had a scooter that he rode around on, and he would ride the scooter to the front door and leave it there so that no one could get in. And he had moments of lucidity. He said to me at one point, "I just feel like I'm in a fog. And I said, do you? And that's all he could say about it. But, this taught me that there are always those moments of illumination and beauty and joy, even in the hardest of situations. And you have to make it up as you go along, and you have to get through it. And I'm struck, by the way, at how their situation parallels the situation so that we are all in now. We're on unfamiliar terrain, terrifying terrain. We're in the middle of it. We're coping as best we can. We don't know how or when it's going to end. So we have come in this time, I think, to appreciate things more. And that's the good part of it. We know now how valuable our friendships are, how great it is to call a friend and say, hey, you want to meet over at this restaurant and have a drink? It just to hug someone, these things that we took for granted. Same thing in this journey with my parents, the things that I took for granted and then only realized their worth when they were gone. But you still have something.
Yeah. What was their love story when they were young? How did they meet and how did they come to fall in love?
They met at the back of a dime store by the parakeets. And my father, who was a lifer in the military, he was in the Army, he was home on leave, and he asked my mother to go out, and they went horseback riding, which is so not something that my mother would have liked to have done, but she did it anyway.
That's a tough first date.
Yeah. And she said, oh, he just kept chasing some blonde who was out there riding that day, which is the only time I've ever heard about my father being anything less than besotted by his wife. But that was their first date. And then he went off to World War II, and they exchanged letters, of course. And my father was on board ship. His duty was to ferry goods and supplies back and forth on the ship. He wasn't in the Navy, but he was the Army guy who guarded things. He got a letter from my mother one day. They had mail call on the deck of the ship, and the letter blew out of his hand, and he jumped in the ocean to retrieve it. That's how much he loved her and her letters. And I asked him many, many, many years later, why did you do that? And he said, I didn't think about it. I mean, he wanted the letter. And I said, well, wasn't that dangerous? And he said, yeah, I guess it was, but he did it. And so then when my dad was stationed in Texas in 1943, in January, my mom took a train to the base where he was stationed to marry him. And her maid of honor was a lieutenant, some guy in the Army. My grandmother did not like my father. And what she told my mother was, he has too much hair. I don't know. I guess that's all she could come up with.
That was the connection.
But my mother, defiantly, and I think she was probably usually a good girl, but nope, this was her guy, and she got on the train and went and married him. And then she lived the life of an Army wife until he retired in 1966. So my siblings and I were brought up as Army brats, moving every 10 minutes. And when he was retiring from the service, she wanted to go home, as she called it, which was Minnesota. So after all those years, that's where she ended up, and she was where they ended up. And my mother was extraordinarily close to her sisters who lived in Minnesota, and they hung around in this pack together. And in this book, the 6 sisters are now 3, and the one who drives is like the prom queen, National Honor Society, most popular girl in the class, and that was my Aunt Tish. And when she fell in a parking lot one day and broke her wrist, that was the end of Tish driving. So there was a lot that my mother was dealing with besides my father. A lot of hard things were happening. And I realized in watching her go through these things that she was much stronger than I ever knew.
You talk a little bit about in the beginning about the shifting dynamic between the two of them, and about your mother asking your mother to make decisions when your father had been the one to do that. That's something that's very hard to do in a relationship as long established as theirs, to change those roles. How did that affect their relationship?
You know, it just goes to show you, because when my mother was, 89, I guess, my dad was 90, she had an epiphany, which was this. When he said, "Do we have those little sundaes in the freezer?" And she said, "Yes." It occurred to her to say, "If you want one, go and get one." Because all her life she would jump up and go get stuff for him and serve him. So, there you are. You only have to wait till you're 89 years old before you think, wait a minute, there could be a little more equality in this relationship.
That's amazing. Yeah, I just want to remind folks as we're talking here that if you have a question, you can type that into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll read those out in a little while, in case you might have missed that part while I was trying to get the speakers to work. I wanted to ask you, Elizabeth, you said at the beginning of our talk here that, you made mistakes, that you did things that now you would do differently. Do you think that there's a right way to negotiate these types of issues? And what would it be?
Empirically, but the trouble is that emotions get in the way. And of course, to say that there's a right way belies the fact that everybody's different. Everybody operates differently. Everybody responds to things differently. So maybe no, maybe there isn't a right way. But I think that if you come from a place of love, you don't mess up entirely, which is not to say that you don't have screaming arguments and moments of extreme frustration and feeling like one mistake I made is that just because you think something is obvious doesn't mean the other person does, and that the progress in these kinds of situations is not linear. You go forward a step and go back two sometimes. Patience is everything. I think it's good to express a lot of things before it gets to the boiling point. I think you need to expect that you're going to be surprised by some of the things that your parents want or say or do. And to try, it's a cliche, but to try as much as possible to take it a day at a time. That said, you do have to make plans at some point if the living situation for your parents is untenable. You have to take more of a role than you might be comfortable doing yourself. You have to parent them now.
And that can be very difficult to recognize, is that moment when that dynamic flips.
Yeah. And of course it's not a single moment, it's on a continuum. And it's people who say I lost my mother before I lost my mother, I really know what they mean now. You go for so long with this idea of who your parents are and what to expect from them, and then everything changes. Most things change, I should say.
Did you get them back through writing the book?
Yeah. Yeah. And also in living the experience. My dad was a really fierce presence. He was the the unsmiling, tough talking guy who scared the hell out of every guy I ever went out with in high school. And we came to understand each other. He became my guy. I was terrified of him. And I never told him until my mid-30s that this didn't happen when he was so mightily compromised at the end. I was in my mid-30s, not my whatever I was in this book, late 60s. And once I told my dad that I was terrified of him and why, that I had been terrified all my life of him, it just broke a dam. It really helped. So that's, again, why I think that it can be helpful to get these things out before they get to be too big.
Did your parents talk about their past, your past as a family with their children? Was that something they did?
Honestly, not so much. We were not a close-knit family. I wasn't close to my sister. I wasn't close to my brother. I'm close to my sister now, and much more to my brother than I was. But my brother lives in Hawaii, so he wasn't around for a lot of this. And I live in Chicago, and my sister lives in Minnesota, so I drove up there a lot, but she bore the brunt of most of this. But we were not a touchy-feely, talk it out kind of family. That's not the dynamic that we had. So that shaped my experience, of course.
In the writing of this book, did you learn anything as a writer from the experience of writing this particular book?
After the fact, I would say I was afraid to publish this book. I didn't know how it would be received, not only by my relatives but by strangers. And what I learned after it was published is how much appreciation there is for being honest and exposing yourself in a way. I think it's helpful for people to know how I screwed up and for me to put it right in there. I mean, it is in there, the mistakes I made and the guilt I felt and the remorse. But again, also those moments that are such a triumph. I'll give you an example that has to do not with my parents, but that made me think of them. And that is that one night I wanted to go to the Chicago Symphony. And so I just jumped in the cab and went down there. And I was sitting very close to the stage, and in front of me was a couple probably in their 90s, really frail, he more than she. But they were dressed up and they came out to the symphony. And when he had to stand up to let people go by him in the row, it was with such difficulty that he did that. When the concert was over, he unfolded his walker and he walked up the aisle, and it seemed to me that they were going an inch an hour. It was excruciatingly slow, but they did it. And I had such admiration and respect for them. And the love between them was absolutely apparent. When she rubbed the arm of his coat, when she helped him up the aisle, and as they were going up the aisle, the crowd was cheering for the performance. But in my head, I thought, they're cheering for this couple who's still in love, still bothers to come to the symphony. It seemed a moment of such sweet triumph to me. And that incident is in the book, as well as many other incidents that affected me that way.
And when people say for better or worse, in sickness and in health,
Yeah.
they
I
mean it.
I thought of that many times, that excuse me, when they got married and They said, oh, yeah. In sickness and health. Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah.
But they did it.
They did it. Yeah. Well, we have a lot of audience questions. I want to see, if we can get to a number of them. But before we do that, Elizabeth, you said you wanted to, there was a passage you wanted to read for us.
Oh, there is. And I'll tell you that it comes very near the end of the book, but that won't ruin it for you at all. I have a friend whose elderly mother lives with her and is driving her crazy. Wait, I got to get some vodka. It's not vodka. Sorry, driving her crazy. Her mother was once a talented artist and intellectual with myriad interests. Now, my friend says, she gets up in the morning and makes a cup of coffee, and she's so slow doing it. I mean, I just watch her sometimes to see how she can possibly be so slow. Then she sits at the kitchen table and talks about what might be for lunch. I just can't stand it. All she talks about is her cup of coffee in the morning and the weather and what her next meal will be. I really wonder, is there any meaning to the end of life? I suppose one way to answer that question is to think about how a baby's meaning in life is a ray of sunshine, the color red, the nearness of his mother's flesh. For a teenager, it is music, fitting in, hormone management. In midlife, meaning comes from focusing on our families, our jobs, our involvement with the world outside our kitchens, which is to say that the meaning of life is ever changing, even as we are. Who's to say that the richest time of life might not be when a cup of morning coffee fills the world? If you found a holy man hidden away on a mountain who found fulfillment in such seemingly simple things, would you not admire him? It is a very warm summer morning, and my parents are both alive and ambulatory. They are still capable of enjoying a slice of apple pie and of having a conversation. They are living together in what will probably be the last home they will ever share. Imagine them at the breakfast table. I'm sorry, kitchen table. My mother will serve breakfast on the embroidered tablecloth. The day will pass. Laundry will be done. The mail will be gotten. The phone will be answered. People they pass in the hall will be acknowledged. Lunch and dinner will be eaten. Someone may drop by for a visit. In the evening, the television will be on and they will sit watching their shows. They will go to bed together. My father has never and will not now go to bed without my mother. And while the moon follows an ancient path across the night sky, they will lie next to each other with their eyes closed. In the morning, the first thing they see will be each other.
That's lovely. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Wanted to ask a few of the questions that are being submitted in our Q&A box here. If you have a question, just a reminder to type that in to that Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Our first question is from Rick. He writes, I said goodbye to my 91-year-old mother last month after 4 years as her caregiver. We both knew nothing about Alzheimer's, and I had to go to many sources to put together a plan. What was your best or most important resource?
Well, we did the thing that a lot of people do. We went to the VA hospital and my dad had a battery of tests. And then we had a family meeting. And we were figuring it out a little bit as we went along, but it was at that family meeting that I really came to understand what my father was capable of and what he was not capable of. And for us, any of us in the family, to think that he was not cooperating was not what was happening. He couldn't. So that's what was most helpful for me.
I have a couple of questions about what you learned about yourself in this experience with your parents.
You know, I would have times when I would think that I was selfish or impatient. I would have times when I'd think, boy, I'm really very wise, very wise. I was all over the place. Uh, but what I learned, and this will a little bit repeat what we were talking about before, but what I learned most is how important it is to listen and how bad most of us are at doing that, because it requires not only shutting up for 5 minutes, but for not thinking about what you're going to answer next when the person has finished talking, to really sort of vacate your brain so that you can take in only what that other person is saying, not only what they're saying, but what they're feeling or meaning behind the words that they're saying, to the extent that you're able to. That's the most important thing, I think, is to listen compassionately.
The question, first name A, last name Broman. When each of my parents had dementia, first my dad, later my mom, my sister and I found ourselves laughing a lot and called it the lighter side of Alzheimer's. Did you have those moments of laughter with your siblings?
Sure. And thank God for that. There was a point at which we were filling out how do you want the end of your life to be with my dad. My mother and did not agree with what my father was saying, because we would ask him things like, do you want to be resuscitated if? And in each situation, he would say yes, unless it's going to cost you a lot of money. Yes, yes. And when we first started doing it with him, he said, well, shouldn't your mother be doing this with me? And we had to explain to him that her feelings were quite different. And not only that, we didn't say this to him, but she was really angry that we were doing this with him, because she thought his answer should be like hers, identical to hers, in fact. So I said to my father at that point, well, here's the deal. If mom gets a hangnail, she wants us to kill her. And that was a joke, obviously. And even my dad laughed. I don't know that my mother laughed, but humor is really important. And I'll tell you another situation. A guy came over to appraise some of the things in my parents' house, an auctioneer. And he was a jerk. And again, this is documented in the book. He really was not the most sensitive of men. And I really didn't like him. I increasingly did not like this guy. I didn't like the things he was saying. I didn't like the way he was handling my parents' things. But it was my sister who was kind of running the show. She was the one who was there most of the time. So I didn't want to say, we're not going to use this guy. I thought, well, if she likes him, then we're going to use this guy. There was a point at which he turned his back to her. And so behind his back, she went like this. And I thought, yeah, okay, we're in agreement then. So I thought that was pretty funny.
You never know what someone else is thinking until the
Yeah,
person you're thinking it about turns around, right?
That's right.
Yeah. We have a couple of questions about how your mother coped with the situation, whether she eventually accepted your father's memory changes and whether you wound up caring for her as well.
My mother never developed dementia, so no. She used to say, this is really heartbreaking to recall. She used to say, every morning I get up and I look in the mirror at myself and I ask God to give me the patience to get through the day. That's a mighty goal, and it's hard to do sometimes. And it's hard to do a lot of the times. And there were times when she was frankly really mean to my father. And that's what this huge fight was about that is in the book. My sister and my mother and I were all screaming at each other because we were finally confronting her with things that she did that we saw as really cruel. And meanwhile, my partner, Bill, was trapped in the kitchen with my dad. You know, they were having a pleasant lunch, having a good conversation. I said, don't let him come in this room because we're going to have this out. So it went on for some time. And when we finally burst forth out of the room, actually, things got better after that. It really did clear the air. And it made my mother think about what she was doing, how she was behaving, what she was asking, what she was not willing to give, and so on. It was a kind of breakthrough, but it was a very painful episode.
I have a question about how to write, how you wrote such personal and emotionally fraught material with restraint.
I didn't think about it. I just had to get it out. And I tend to be a kind of economical writer in any case. But I think particularly when I write nonfiction, I tend to write that way. But any kind of writing I do is very, E.B. White famously said he didn't like to look under the hood, nor do I. I'm not exactly aware of what I'm doing when I'm doing it, when I'm writing. So this was more of the same, I guess. I'm glad that that you did see some restraint. It would be unbearable otherwise.
A couple of questions about the same thing, so I'm going to combine those. A couple of our audience members want to know if you've had conversations with your loved ones about your wishes and whether this experience with your parents changed those conversations.
In the very beginning of the book, I say that I am in this kind of in-between place. I don't feel I'm old. I still feel, as I said in the book, like a girl inside, which is something I heard two old women. I heard one of them say to the other in a grocery store one day. I passed by them and they were talking, and I heard one of them say, and they were really old, I heard one of them say, I still feel like a girl inside. And I thought, really? But now I know what she was talking about, because I still feel like a girl inside. But I'm certainly not young anymore. And I know I'm getting to the point where I'll have to say what it is I want. I do have a will and so on, but it's more than that, of course. And if my daughters didn't know before, they know now, because it's in the book that I want a pod burial so I can nourish a tree and so on. But yeah, that's one of those things, I don't know. You keep putting it off and putting it off because you still feel okay. And I suppose you can put it off until it's too late. So I haven't had a really specific talk, but I think both my daughters learned a lot from reading this book about everything.
I have a question here from Della, who wants to know, does your novel Dream When You're Feeling Blue spring from your imagination of your parents' World War I experiences?
It's World War II. Yes, I told you my mother was very close to her sisters. And when I wrote Dream When You're Feeling Blue, I interviewed them about what life was like during the war. I knew that they grew up with not a whole lot of money. I knew that they slept 2 or even 3 to a bed. I knew that they shared clothes, and that the first sister to get up got the best looking outfit of the day because she had first pick. But I talked to them about what it was like then, and drawing lines on the back of their legs to look like seams because they didn't have nylons, and how the buses and the trains would be so full of servicemen, and how it was a really terrible and tragic time, but also they were young women and it was kind of fun and romantic. It was both. I did tons of research for that book. But I also talked to my mother and her sisters and my uncles, one of whom was on Omaha Beach. And he had never talked about that experience, but he did talk about it with me. He felt it was time. And he said, you know, the water really did turn red with blood. And he talked about how they were pinned down for so long. Another uncle told me that he was in the trenches and he was delivered his dinner, and he stood up in the trench to receive his dinner and got shot in the chest, went to the field hospital, got all fixed up, and went and got right back in that trench and never even told his fiance that that had happened. There were all kinds of stories that I read, watched videos of. It was so inspiring. Those people, that time.
I have a couple of process questions here. One from Marisa, who wants to know, how vital is the role of the editor in your writing experience? Have you worked with the same editor for many years?
I'll answer the second one first. Yes, I've worked with the same editor for many years, and I believe that it's really important to keep, it's like church and state, the editorial process and the writing process. I think you need to write as though no one's ever going to read it, so that you can get closer to the bone and do what you really want to do and not be swayed by what you think you should do or what people will like or dislike, and so on and so on. That to keep it a council of one, just please yourself first. The role of the editor is important because they have a little distance and perspective that you don't have as the writer. Sometimes my editor once she wanted me to do literally nothing, not one thing. And that was my first novel. So I thought, well, this is easy. Other times she has a lot more to say. So ultimately, she will say, well, it's your book, which is a very respectful thing to do, I think. But I do listen to her and I admire her very much.
I have an anonymous question that's asking about the challenges or differences in getting a book published during the time of COVID.
I don't know is the answer. I know that when this all began, my editor called me and she said, publishing is going to be very different now. I think they're feeling their way along just like everybody else. But even before COVID, the publishing industry had changed a lot. There used to be a great number of boutique publishers who would take a chance on a literary voice and publish a small, beautiful book that they didn't expect to hit the New York Times bestseller list, but nonetheless would be a jewel to have upon the earth. And that has all but disappeared. There's a lot of bottom line orientation. Publishers are worried, just like everybody else is, about the bottom line, about staying in business. That said, I think that editors are people who love books and reading, and that talent will win out even in a tougher climate. So I always think it's a mistake to try to write to something, to try to sound like someone else, or to try to write a bestseller. I think you have to keep the process as pure as you can.
We have a question from Kate, who wants to know, what authors do you follow, either on social media or as they publish their works?
My favorite writer is Alice Munro. She's a Canadian, primarily short story writer, but also I think she did one novel anyway, but her short stories are like novels. They're so full and rich and astonishingly good. Right after that is Ann Tyler. I've loved Ann Tyler since I first read her many, many years ago. She's an author whose book I'll just pick up and buy without even looking inside it whenever a new one comes out. Any interview with her, I'd read her grocery list. She is a master at capturing someone so sparingly and so sometimes funnily. E.B. White is one of my favorite writers for his economy, for his humor, for his politics, for the way he loves his Dash and Fred. There are so many. Rachel Joyce is a writer I've really come to love lately for her humanity. And I love poetry. I read a lot of poetry. It's a really economical way to understand things, to look at the world, to come to appreciate the world. I was looking to see if there's a book I'm reading called In the Shelter, and I can't pronounce the author's name, but he's a theologian and a poet. And I am really taken with that book. Really taken with that book. It's very rich and true.
I can't be the only one who listened to that and started making a list. It's a good thing we all, now that so few of us are commuting, we all have more time to read.
Yeah, some people have said that they find it difficult to read now. For me and for a lot of others, it's been the opposite. Like books are just a lifesaver. My partner Bill and I are reading aloud every night from Jerry Seinfeld's book called "Is This Anything?" It's uneven. Not everything in there is terrific, but lots of it is, and some of it is so funny I can't catch my breath. And we all need that now. So that's a recommendation I'd make.
Yeah. And a question about what the poetry book that you just mentioned was, In the Shelter, correct? Was the title?
Yeah, yes. It's not just poetry, it's prose, and there is some poetry in it. It's deeply spiritual. My own religious, for lack of a better word, beliefs are very vague. I mean, I don't know. But I appreciate the kind of honesty and sensibility that is in that book, and I'm underlining in it like crazy.
Time, I think, for one more question. So I wanted to end with this one from Judy. Was your father able to retrieve the letter that fell into the ocean?
Yes. We wouldn't have got out of the ocean otherwise. And I asked at one point, and I was a writer at this point, I asked my mother, do you still have all the letters between you and Dad? And she said, no, I don't have them anymore. And I think it was because she didn't want me to write about them. They were too personal, and good for her. Bill just handed me the book. This is what it looks like, In the Shelter. And his name is Padraig Otwama. See why I couldn't pronounce it? But this is what it looks like. Yeah, what a guy. He lives in Belfast and he teaches and he writes poetry books, but I was drawn to try this one first, and now I'm going to get every single thing he ever did. Also, a novel, if I can just take 1 second to tell you.
Oh, sure.
Douglas Stewart wrote a novel called Shuggie Bain, which is absolutely sensational. It's nominated for, it's a debut novel about a boy growing up in Scotland, a gay boy. Starts when he's 5 and goes up to when he's about 17. His mother's an alcoholic. His father abandons him. It sounds like a real romp, right? But there's so much laugh out loud humor in here. The characterizations are just awesome. And the dialogue is the kind that you want to read over and over again. Shuggie Bain, nominated for the Booker. He'll find out tomorrow if he won. And also nominated, I think, Bill will yell at me if I get this wrong, I hope he'll tell me National Book Award. Did you hear that voice coming from the other room?
Hear it, yes.
National Book Award. It's a nice big fat novel. I was instantly pulled in reading it, and I read it twice, and I never do that.
Well, that's a recommendation if we ever heard it. Yeah. Well, thank you very much for being here with us and for sharing so much of yourself in this book and with us here tonight, Elizabeth. Thank you. And
thanks to everybody who came. You were probably going to say that, but I just want everybody who's there to know I really appreciate your being there.
Yeah. Thank you.